The Wrong Grave. Written by Kelly Link. All of this happened because a boy I once knew named Miles Sperry decided to go into the resurrectionist business and dig up the grave of his girlfriend, Bethany Baldwin, who had been dead for not quite a year. Miles planned to do this in order to recover the sheaf of poems he had, and what he felt was a beautiful and romantic gesture, put into her casket. Or possibly it had just been a really dumb thing to do. He hadn't made copies. Miles had always been impulsive. I think you should know that right up front. He tucked the poems, handwritten, tear-stained, and with crossouts, under Bethany's hands. Her fingers had felt like candles, fat and waxy and pleasantly cool, until you remembered that they were fingers. And he couldn't help noticing that there was something wrong about her breasts. They seemed larger. If Bethany had known that she was going to die, would she have gone all the way with him? One of his poems was about that, about how now they never would, how it was too late now. Carpe diem before you run out of DM. Bethany's eyes were closed. Someone had done that too, just like they'd arranged her hands, and even her smile looked composed, in the wrong sense of the word. Miles wasn't sure how you made someone smile after they were dead. Bethany didn't look much like she had when she'd been alive. That had been only a few days ago. It was the nearest Miles had ever been to a dead person, and he stood there, looking at Bethany, wishing two things, that he were dead too, and also that it had seemed appropriate to bring along his notebook and a pen. He felt he should be taking notes. After all, this was the most significant thing that had ever happened to Miles. A great change was occurring within him, moment by singular moment. Poets were supposed to be in the moment and also stand outside the moment, looking in. For example, Miles had never noticed before, but Bethany's ears were slightly lopsided. One smaller and slightly higher up. Not that he would have cared, or written a poem about it or even mentioned it to her, ever, in case it made her self-conscious, but it was a fact, and now that he'd noticed it, he thought it might have driven him crazy, not mentioning it. He bent over and kissed Bethany's forehead, breathing in. She smelled like a new car. Miles's mind was full of poetic thoughts. Every cloud had a silver lining, except there was probably a more interesting and meaningful way to say that, and death wasn't really a cloud. He thought about what it was. More like an earthquake, maybe, or falling from a great height and smacking into the ground, really hard, which knocked the wind out of you and made it hard to sleep or wake up or eat or care about things like homework or whether there was anything good on TV. And death was foggy too, but also prickly, so maybe instead of a cloud, a fog made of little sharp things. Needles. Every death fog has a lot of silver needles. Did that make sense? Did it scan? Then the thought came to Miles, like the tolling of a large and leaden bell, that Bethany was dead. This may sound strange, but in my experience it's strange and it's also just how it works. You wake up and you remember that the person you love is dead. And then you think, really? Then you think how strange it is, how you have to remind yourself that the person you love is dead, and even while you're thinking about that, the thought comes to you again that the person you love is dead. And it's the same stupid fog, the same needles or mallet to the intestines or whatever worse thing you want to call it, all over again. But you'll see for yourself someday. Miles stood there remembering until Bethany's mother, Mrs. Baldwin, came up beside him. Her eyes were dry, but her hair was a mess. She'd only managed to put eyeshadow on one eyelid. She was wearing jeans and one of Bethany's old t-shirts. Not even one of Bethany's favorite t-shirts. Miles felt embarrassed for her, and for Bethany, too. "What's that?" Mrs. Baldwin said. Her voice sounded rusty and outlandish, as if she were translating from some other language. Something Indo-Germanic, perhaps. "My poems." "Poems I wrote for her," Miles said. He felt very solemn. This was a historic moment. One day Miles's biographers would write about this. 3 haikus, a sestina, and 2 villanelles. Some longer pieces. No one else will ever read them. Mrs. Baldwin looked into Miles's face with her terrible, dry eyes. "I see," she said. "She said you were a lousy poet." She put her hand down into the casket, smoothed Bethany's favorite dress, the one with spider webs and several holes through which you could see Bethany's itchy black tights. She patted Bethany's hands and said, "Well, goodbye, old girl. Don't forget to send a postcard." Don't ask me what she meant by this. Sometimes Bethany's mother said strange things. She was a lapsed Buddhist and a substitute math teacher. Once she caught Miles cheating on an algebra quiz. Relations between Miles and Mrs. Baldwin had not improved during the time that Bethany and Miles were dating, and Miles couldn't decide whether or not to believe her about Bethany not liking his poetry. Substitute teachers had strange senses of humor when they had them at all. He almost reached into the casket and took his poetry back. But Mrs. Baldwin would have thought that she'd proved something, that she'd won. Not that this was a situation where anyone was going to win anything. This was a funeral, not a game show. Nobody was going to get to take Bethany home. Mrs. Baldwin looked at Miles and Miles looked back. Bethany wasn't looking at anyone. The 2 people that Bethany had loved most in the world could see, through that dull hateful fog, what the other was thinking, just for a minute. And although you weren't there, and even if you had been, you wouldn't have known what they were thinking anyway. I'll tell you. I wish it had been me, Miles thought. And Mrs. Baldwin thought, I wish it had been you too. Miles put his hands into the pockets of his new suit, turned, and left Mrs. Baldwin standing there. He went and sat next to his own mother, who was trying very hard not to cry. She'd liked Bethany. Everyone had liked Bethany. A few rows in front, a girl named April Lamb was picking her nose in some kind of frenzy of grief. When they got to the cemetery, there was another funeral service going on. The burial of the girl who had been in the other car. And the 2 groups of mourners glared at each other as they parked their cars and tried to figure out which grave to gather around. 2 florists had misspelled Bethany's name on the ugly wreaths. Berthany and also Bethany, just like tribe members did when they were voting each other out on the television show, Survivor. Which had always been Bethany's favorite thing about Survivor. Bethany had been an excellent speller, although the Lutheran minister who was conducting the sermon didn't mention that. Miles had an uncomfortable feeling. He became aware that he couldn't wait to get home and call Bethany, to tell her all about this, about everything that had happened since she died. He sat and waited until the feeling wore off. It was a feeling he was getting used to. Bethany had liked Miles because he made her laugh. He makes me laugh too. Miles figured that digging up Bethany's grave, even that would have made her laugh. Bethany had had a great laugh, which went up and up like a clarinetist on an escalator. It wasn't annoying. It had been delightful, if you liked that kind of laugh. It would have made Bethany laugh that Miles Googled grave digging in order to educate himself. He read an Edgar Allan Poe story, he watched several relevant episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and he bought Vicks Vapo Rub, which you were supposed to apply under your nose. He bought equipment at Target, a special, battery-operated, telescoping shovel, a set of wire cutters, a flashlight, extra batteries for the shovel and flashlight, and even a Velcro headband with a headlamp that came with a special red lens filter. So that you were less likely to be noticed. Miles printed out a map of the cemetery so that he could find his way to Bethany's grave off Weeping Fish Lane, even, as an acquaintance of mine once remarked, in the dead of night when naught can be seen, so pitch is the dark. Not that the dark would be very pitch. Miles had picked a night when the moon would be full. The map was also just in case, because he'd seen movies where the dead rose from their graves. You wanted to have all the exits marked in a situation like that. He told his mother that he was spending the night at his friend John's house. He told his friend John not to tell his mother anything. If Miles had Googled poetry as well as digging up graves, he would have discovered that his situation was not without precedent. The poet and painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti also buried his poetry with his dead lover. Rossetti, too, had regretted this gesture, had eventually decided to dig up his lover to get back his poems. I'm telling you this so that you never make the same mistake. I can't tell you whether Dante Gabriel Rossetti was a better poet than Miles, although Rossetti had a sister, Christina Rossetti, who was really something. But you're not interested in my views on poetry. I know you better than that, even if you don't know me. You're waiting for me to get to the part about grave digging. Miles had a couple of friends and he thought about asking someone to come along on the expedition. But no one except for Bethany knew that Miles wrote poetry. And Bethany had been dead for a while. 11 months, in fact, which was 1 month longer than Bethany had been Miles's girlfriend. Long enough that Miles was beginning to make his way out of the fog and the needles. Long enough that he could listen to certain songs on the radio again. Long enough that sometimes there was something dream-like about his memories of Bethany, as if she'd been a movie that he'd seen a long time ago, late at night on television. Long enough that when he tried to reconstruct the poems he'd written her, especially the Villanelle, which had been, in his opinion, really quite good, he couldn't. It was as if when he put those poems into the casket, he hadn't just given Bethany the only copies of some poems but had instead given away those shining, perfect lines, given them away so thoroughly that he'd never be able to write them out again. Miles knew that Bethany was dead. There was nothing to do about that. But the poetry was different. You have to salvage what you can, even if you're the one who buried it in the first place. You might think at certain points in the story that I'm being hard on Miles, that I'm not sympathetic to his situation. This isn't true. I'm as fond of Miles as I am of anyone else. I don't think he's any stupider or any bit less special or remarkable than, for example, you. Anyone might accidentally dig up the wrong grave. It's a mistake anyone could make. The moon was full, and the map was easy to read even without the aid of the flashlight. The cemetery was full of cats. Don't ask me why. Miles was not afraid. He was resolute. The battery-operated telescoping shovel at first refused to untelescope. He tested it in his own backyard, but here, in the cemetery, it seemed unbearably loud. It scared off the cats for a while, but it didn't draw any unwelcome attention. The cats came back. Miles set aside the wreaths and bouquets, and then he used his wire cutters to trace a rectangle. He stuck the telescoping shovel under and pried up fat squares of sod above Bethany's grave. He stacked them up like carpet samples and got to work. By 2 a.m., Miles had knotted a length of rope at short, regular intervals for footholds and then looped it around a tree so he'd be able to climb out of the grave again once he'd retrieved his poetry. He was waist deep in the hole he'd made. The night was warm, and he was sweating. It was hard work, directing the shovel. Every once in a while it telescoped while he was using it. He borrowed his mother's gardening gloves to keep from getting blisters, but still his hands were getting tired. The gloves were too big. His arms ached. By 3:30, Miles could no longer see out of the grave in any direction except up. A large white cat came and peered down at Miles, grew bored, and left again. The moon moved over Miles's head like a spotlight. He began to wield the shovel more carefully. He didn't want to damage Bethany's casket. When the shovel struck something that was not dirt, Miles remembered that he'd left the Vicks Vapo Rub on his bed at home. He improvised with a cherry chapstick he found in his pocket. Now he used his garden-gloved hands to dig and to smooth dirt away. The bloody light emanating from his Velcro headband picked out the ingenious telescoping ridges of the discarded shovel, the little rocks and worms and worm-like roots that poked out of the dirt walls of Miles's excavation. The lid of Bethany's casket. Miles realized he was standing on the lid. Perhaps he should have made the hole a bit wider. It would be difficult to get the lid open while standing on it. He needed to pee, there was that as well. So he pulled himself back up along the rope with his tired hands and went off to find somewhere private. When he came back, he shone his flashlight into the grave. It seemed to him that the lid of the coffin was slightly ajar. Was that possible? Had he damaged the hinges with the telescoping shovel or kicked the lid askew somehow when he was shimmying up the rope? He essayed a slow, judicious sniff, but all he smelled was dirt and cherry chapstick. He applied more cherry chapstick, just in case. Then he lowered himself into the grave. The lid wobbled when he tested it with his feet. He decided that if he kept hold of the rope and slid his foot down and under the lid, like so, then perhaps he could cantilever the lid up. It was very strange. It felt as if something had hold on his foot. He tried to tug it free, but no. His foot was stuck, caught in some kind of vice or grip. He lowered the toe of his other hiking boot down into the black gap between the coffin and its lid and tentatively poked it forward, but this produced no result. He'd have to let go of the rope and lift the lid with his hands. Balance like so, carefully, on the thin rim of the casket. Figure out how he was caught. It was hard work, balancing and lifting at the same time, although the one foot was still firmly wedged in its accidental toe hold. Miles became aware of his own breathing, the furtive scuffling noise of his other boot against the coffin lid. Even the red beam of his lamp as it pitched and swung, back and forth, up and down, and the narrow space seemed unutterably noisy. Shit, Miles whispered. It was either that or else scream. He got his fingers under the lid of the coffin on either side of his feet and bent his wobbly knees so he wouldn't hurt his back lifting. Something touched the fingers of his right hand. No, his fingers had touched something. Don't be ridiculous, Miles. He yanked the lid up as fast and hard as he could, the way you would rip off a bandage if you suspected there were baby spiders hatching under it. Shit. He yanked and someone else pushed. The lid shut up and fell back against the opposite embankment of dirt. The dead girl who had hold of Miles's boot let go. This was the first of the many unexpected and unpleasant shocks that Miles was to endure for the sake of poetry. The second was the sickening, no, shocking, shock that he had dug up the wrong grave, the wrong dead girl. The wrong dead girl was lying there, smiling up at him, and her eyes were open. She was several years older than Bethany. She was taller and had a significantly more developed rack. She even had a tattoo. The smile of the wrong dead girl was white and orthodontically perfected. Bethany had had braces that turned kissing into a heroic feat. You had to kiss around braces, slide your tongue up or sideways or under, like navigating through barbed wire. A delicious, tricky trip through no man's land. Bethany pursed her mouth forward when she kissed. If Miles forgot and mashed his lips down too hard on hers, she whacked him on the back of his head. This was one of the things about his relationship with Bethany that Miles remembered vividly as he looked down at the wrong dead girl. The wrong dead girl spoke first. Knock knock, she said. What? Miles said. Knock knock, the wrong dead girl said again. Who's there? Miles said. Gloria, the wrong dead girl said. Gloria Palnick. Who are you and what are you doing in my grave? This isn't your grave, Miles said, aware that he was arguing with a dead girl, and the wrong dead girl at that. This is Bethany's grave. What are you doing in Bethany's grave? Oh no, Gloria Palnick said. This is my grave and I get to ask the questions. A notion crept, like little dead cat feet, over Miles. Possibly he had made a dangerous and deeply embarrassing mistake. Poetry, he managed to say. There was some poetry that I accidentally left in my girlfriend's casket. And there's a deadline for a poetry contest coming up, and so I really needed to get it back. The dead girl stared at him. There was something about her hair that Miles didn't like. Excuse me, but are you for real? She said. This sounds like one of those lame excuses. The dog ate my homework. I accidentally buried my poetry with my dead girlfriend. Look, Miles said, I checked the tombstone and everything. This is supposed to be Bethany's grave. Bethany Baldwin. I'm really sorry I bothered you and everything, but this isn't really my fault. The dead girl just stared at him thoughtfully. He wished that she would blink. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her hair Lincoln black, where Bethany's had been brownish and frizzy in summer, was writhing a little, like snakes. Miles thought of centipedes. Inky midnight tentacles. Maybe I should just go away, Miles said. Leave you to, rest in peace or whatever. I don't think sorry cuts the mustard here, Gloria Palnick said. She barely moved her mouth when she spoke, Miles noticed dreamily. And yet her enunciation was fine. Besides, I'm sick of this place. It's boring. Maybe I'll just come along with you. What? Miles said. He felt behind himself, surreptitiously, for the knotted rope. I said, maybe I'll come with, Gloria Palnick said. She sat up. Her hair was really coiling around, really seething now. Miles thought he could hear hissing noises. You can't do that. He said. I'm sorry, but no. Just no. Well then, you stay here and keep me company, Gloria Palnick said. Her hair was really something. I can't do that either, Miles said, trying to explain quickly, before the dead girl's hair decided to strangle him. I'm going to be a poet. It would be a great loss to the world if I never got a chance to publish my poetry. I see, Gloria Palnick said, as if she did, in fact, see a great deal. Her hair settled back down on her shoulders and began to act a lot more like hair. You don't want me to come home with you. You don't want to stay here with me. Then how about this? If you're such a great poet, then write me a poem. Write something about me so that everyone will be sad that I died. I could do that, Miles said. Relief bubbled up through his middle like tiny donuts bobbing in an industrial deep-fat fryer. Let's do that. You lie down and make yourself comfortable and I'll rebury you. Today I've got a quiz in American history, and I was going to study for it during my free period after lunch, but I could write a poem for you instead. Today is Saturday, the dead girl said. Oh, hey, Miles said. Then no problem. I'll go straight home and work on your poem. Should be done by Monday. Not so fast, Gloria Palnick said. You need to know all about my life and about me if you're going to write a poem about me, right? And how do I know you'll write a poem if I let you bury me again? How will I know if the poem's any good? No dice. I'm coming home with you and I'm sticking around until I get my poem, okay? She stood up. She was several inches taller than Miles. Do you have any chapstick? She said. My lips are really dry. Here, Miles said. Then, you can keep it. Oh, afraid of dead girl cooties, Gloria Palnick said. She smacked her lips at him in an upsetting way. I'll climb up first, Miles said. He had the idea that if he could just get up the rope, if he could yank the rope up after himself fast enough, he might be able to run away, get to the fence where he chained up his bike, before Gloria managed to get out. It wasn't like she knew where he lived. She didn't even know his name. "Fine," Gloria said. She looked like she knew what Miles was thinking and didn't really care. By the time Miles had bolted up the rope, yanking it up out of the grave, abandoning the telescoping shovel, the wire cutters, the wrong dead girl, and had unlocked his road bike and was racing down the empty 5 a.m. road. The little red dot of light from his headlamp falling into potholes, he'd almost managed to persuade himself that it had all been a grisly hallucination. Except for the fact that the dead girl's cold dead arms were around his waist, suddenly, and her cold dead face was pressed against his back, her damp hair coiling around his head and tapping at his mouth, burrowing down his filthy shirt. "Don't leave me like that again," she said. "No," Miles said. "I won't. Sorry." He couldn't take the dead girl home. He couldn't think of how to explain it to his parents. No. He didn't want to take her over to John's house either. It was far too complicated. Not just the girl, but he was covered in dirt. John wouldn't be able to keep his big mouth shut. "Where are we going?" the dead girl said. "I know a place," Miles said. "Could you please not put your hands under my shirt? They're really cold. And your fingernails are kind of sharp." "Sorry," the dead girl said. They rode along in silence until they were passing the 7-Eleven at the corner of 8th and Walnut, and the dead girl said, "Could we stop for a minute? I'd like some beef jerky. And a Diet Coke." Miles braked. "Beef jerky?" he said. "Is that what dead people eat?" "It's the preservatives," the dead girl said, somewhat obscurely. Miles gave up. He steered the bike into the parking lot. "Let go, please," he said. The dead girl let go. He got off the bike and turned around. He'd been wondering just exactly how she'd managed to sit behind him on the bike, and he saw that she was sitting above the rear tire on a cushion of her horrible, shiny hair. Her legs were stretched out on either side, toes and black combat boots floating just above the asphalt, and yet the bike didn't fall over. It just hung there under her. For the first time in almost a month, Miles found himself thinking about Bethany as if she were still alive. Bethany is never going to believe this. But then, Bethany had never believed in anything like ghost. She'd hardly believed in the school dress code. She definitely wouldn't have believed in a dead girl who could float around on her hair like it was an anti-gravity device. "I can also speak fluent Spanish," Gloria Palnick said. Miles reached into his back pocket for his wallet and discovered that the pocket was full of dirt. "I can't go in there," he said. "For one thing, I'm a kid and it's 5 in the morning. Also, I look like I just escaped from a gang of naked mole rats. I'm filthy." The dead girl just looked at him. He said coaxingly, "You should go in. You're older. I'll give you all the money I've got. You go in and I'll stay out here and work on the poem. You'll ride off and leave me here," the dead girl said. She didn't sound angry, just matter of fact. But her hair was beginning to float up. It lifted her up off of Miles's bike in a kind of hairy cloud and then plaited itself down her back in a long business-like rope. "I won't," Miles promised. "Here. Take this. Buy whatever you want." Gloria Palnick checked the money. "How very generous of you," she said. "No problem," Miles told her. "I'll wait here." And he did wait. He waited until Gloria Palnick went into the 7-Eleven. Then he counted to 30, waited 1 second more, got back on his bike, and rode away. By the time he'd made it to the meditation cabin in the woods back behind Bethany's mother's house, where he and Bethany had liked to sit and play Monopoly, Miles felt as if things were under control again, more or less. There is nothing so calming as a meditation cabin where long, boring games of Monopoly have taken place. He'd clean up in the cabin sink and maybe take a nap. Bethany's mother never went out there. Her ex-husband's meditation clothes, his scratchy prayer mat, all his Buddhas and scrolls and incense holders and posters of Che Guevara were still out there. Miles had snuck into the cabin a few times since Bethany's death, to sit in the dark and listen to the plink-plink of the meditation fountain and think about things. He was sure Bethany's mother wouldn't have minded if she knew, although he hadn't ever asked, just in case. Which had been wise of him. The key to the cabin was on the beam just above the door, but he didn't need it after all. The door stood open. There was a smell of incense and of other things. Cherry chapstick and dirt and beef jerky. There was a pair of black combat boots beside the door. Miles squared his shoulders. I have to admit that he was behaving sensibly here, finally. Finally. Because, and Miles and I are in agreement for once, if the dead girl could follow him somewhere before he even knew exactly where he was going, then there was no point in running away. Anywhere he went, she'd already be there. Miles took off his shoes, because you were supposed to take off your shoes when you went into the cabin. It was a gesture of respect. He put them down beside the combat boots and went inside. The waxed pine floor felt silky under his bare feet. He looked down and saw that he was walking on Gloria Palnick's hair. Sorry, Miles said. He meant several things by that. He meant sorry for walking on your hair. Sorry for writing off and leaving you in the 7-Eleven after promising that I wouldn't. Sorry for the grave wrong I've done you. But most of all he meant sorry, dead girl, that I ever dug you up in the first place. Don't mention it, the dead girl said. Want some jerky? Miles became aware that he was hungry. Sure, he said. He was beginning to feel he would have liked this dead girl under other circumstances, despite her annoying, bullying hair. She had poise. A sense of humor. She seemed to have what his mother called stick-to-itiveness, what the AP English exam prefers to call tenacity. Miles recognized the quality. He had it in no small degree himself. The dead girl was also extremely pretty, if you ignored the hair. You might think less of Miles that he thought so well of the dead girl that this was a betrayal of Bethany. Miles felt it was a betrayal. But he thought that Bethany might have liked the dead girl too. She would certainly have liked her tattoo. How is the poem coming? The dead girl said. There's not a lot that rhymes with Gloria, Miles said. Or Palnick. Toothpick, said the dead girl. There was a fragment of jerky caught in her teeth. Euphoria. Maybe you should write the stupid poem, Miles said. There was an awkward pause, broken only by the almost noiseless glide of hair retreating across a pine floor. Miles sat down, sweeping the floor with his hand, just in case. You were going to tell me something about your life, he said. Boring, Gloria Palnick said. Short. Over. That's not much to work with. Unless you want a haiku. Tell me about this girl you are trying to dig up, Gloria said. The one you wrote the poetry for. Her name was Bethany, Miles said. She died in a car crash. Was she pretty? Gloria said. Yeah, Miles said. You liked her a lot, Gloria said. Yeah, Miles said. Are you sure you're a poet? Gloria asked. Miles was silent. He gnawed his jerky ferociously. It tasted like dirt. Maybe he'd write a poem about it. That would show Gloria Palnick. He swallowed and said, "Why were you in Bethany's grave?" "How should I know?" she said. She was sitting across from him, leaning against a concrete Buddha the size of a 3-year-old, but much fatter and holier. Her hair hung down over her face, just like in a Japanese horror movie. "What do you think? That Bethany and I have swapped coffins just for fun?" "Is Bethany like you?" Miles said. "Does she have weird hair and follow people around and scare them just for fun?" "No," the dead girl said through her hair. "Not for fun." "But what's wrong with having a little fun? It gets dull. And why should we stop having fun just because we are dead? It's not all demon cocktails and Scrabble down in the old bardo, you know?" "You know what's weird?" Miles said. "You sound like her. Bethany. You say the same kind of stuff." "It was dumb to try to get your poems back," said the dead girl. "You can't just give something to somebody and then take it back again." "I just miss her," Miles said. He began to cry. After a while, the dead girl got up and came over to him. She took a big handful of her hair and wiped his face with it. It was soft and absorbent, and it made Miles's skin crawl. He stopped crying, which might have been what the dead girl was hoping. "Go home," she said. Miles shook his head. "No," he finally managed to say. He was shivering like crazy. "Why not?" the dead girl said. "Because I'll go home and then you'll be there, waiting for me. And you'll eat my parents or tell them about how I dug up Bethany's grave. About how I couldn't even get that right." "I won't," the dead girl said. "I promise." "Really?" Miles said. "I really promise," said the dead girl. "I'm sorry I teased you, Miles." "That's okay," Miles said. He got up and then he just stood there, looking down at her. He seemed to be about to ask her something, and then he changed his mind. She could see this happen, and she could see why too. He knew he ought to leave now, while she was willing to let him go. He didn't want to mess up by asking something impossible and obvious and stupid. That was okay by her. She couldn't be sure that he wouldn't say something that would rile up her hair. Not to mention the tattoo. She didn't think he'd noticed when her tattoo had started getting annoyed. "Goodbye," Miles said at last. It almost looked as if he wanted her to shake his hand, but when she sent out a length of her hair, he turned and ran. It was a little disappointing. And the dead girl couldn't help but notice that he'd left his shoes and his bike behind. The dead girl walked around the cabin, picking things up and putting them down again. She kicked the Monopoly box, which was a game that she'd always hated. That was one of the okay things about being dead, that nobody ever wanted to play Monopoly. At last she came to the statue of St. Francis, whose head had been knocked right off during an indoor game of croquet a long time ago. Bethany Baldwin had made St. Francis a lumpy substitute Ganesh head out of modeling clay. You could lift that clay elephant head off and there was a hollow space where Miles and Bethany had left secret things for each other. The dead girl reached down her shirt and into the cavity where her more interesting and useful organs had once been. She had been an organ donor. She'd kept Miles' poetry in there for safekeeping. She folded up the poetry, wedged it inside St. Francis, and fixed the Ganesh head back on. Maybe Miles would find it someday. She would have liked to see the look on his face. We don't often get a chance to see our dead. Still less often do we know them when we see them. Mrs. Baldwin's eyes opened. She looked up and saw the dead girl and smiled. She said, "Bethany." Bethany sat down on her mother's bed. She took her mother's hand. If Mrs. Baldwin thought Bethany's hand was cold, she didn't say so. She held on tightly. "I was dreaming about you," she told Bethany. You were in an Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. It was just a dream, Bethany said. Mrs. Baldwin reached up and touched a piece of Bethany's hair with her other hand. You've changed your hair, she said. I like it. They were both silent. Bethany's hair stayed very still. Perhaps it felt flattered. Thank you for coming back, Mrs. Baldwin said at last. I can't stay, Bethany said. Mrs. Baldwin held her daughter's hand tighter. I'll go with you. That's why you've come, isn't it? Because I'm dead too? Bethany shook her head. No. Sorry. You're not dead. It's Miles's fault. He dug me up. He did what? Mrs. Baldwin said. She forgot the small, lowering unhappiness of discovering that she was not dead after all. He wanted his poetry back, Bethany said. The poems he gave me. That idiot, Mrs. Baldwin said. It was exactly the sort of thing she expected of Miles, but only with the advantage of hindsight, because how could you really expect such a thing? What did you do to him? I played a good joke on him, Bethany said. She'd never really tried to explain her relationship with Miles to her mother. It seemed especially pointless now. She wriggled her fingers, and her mother instantly let go of Bethany's hand. Being a former Buddhist, Mrs. Baldwin had always understood that when you hold onto your children too tightly, you end up pushing them away instead. Except that after Bethany had died, she wished she'd held on a little tighter. She drank up Bethany with her eyes. She noted the tattoo on Bethany's forearm with both disapproval and delight. Disapproval because one day Bethany might regret getting a tattoo of a cobra that wrapped all the way around her bicep. Delight because something about the tattoo suggested Bethany was really here. That this wasn't just a dream. She would never have dreamed that her daughter was alive again and tattooed and wearing long, writhing, midnight tails of hair. I have to go, Bethany said. She had turned her head a little, toward the window as if she were listening for something far away. Oh, her mother said, trying to sound as if she didn't mind. She didn't want to ask, will you come back? She was a lapsed Buddhist, but not so very lapsed, after all. She was still working to relinquish all desire, all hope, all self. When a person like Mrs. Baldwin suddenly finds that her life has been dismantled by a great catastrophe, she may then hold on to her belief as if to a life raft, even if the belief is this: that one should hold on to nothing. Mrs. Baldwin had taken her Buddhism very seriously once, before substitute teaching had knocked it out of her. Bethany stood up. I'm sorry I wrecked the car, she said, although this wasn't completely true. If she'd still been alive, she would have been sorry. But she was dead. She didn't know how to be sorry anymore. And the longer she stayed, the more likely it seemed that her hair would do something truly terrible. Her hair was not good Buddhist hair. It did not love the living world or the things in the living world, and it did not love them in an utterly unenlightened way. There was nothing of light or enlightenment about Bethany's hair. It knew nothing of hope, but it had desires and ambitions. It's best not to speak of those ambitions. As for the tattoo, it wanted to be left alone. And to be allowed to eat people, just every once in a while. When Bethany stood up, Mrs. Baldwin said suddenly, I've been thinking I might give up substitute teaching. Bethany waited. I might go to Japan to teach English, Mrs. Baldwin said. Sell the house, just pack up and go. Is that okay with you? Do you mind? Bethany didn't mind. She bent over and kissed her mother on her forehead. She left a smear of cherry chapstick. When she had gone, Mrs. Baldwin got up and put on her bathrobe, the one with white cranes and frogs. She went downstairs and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing. Her coffee got cold and she never even noticed. The dead girl left town as the sun was coming up. I won't tell you where she went. Maybe she joined the circus and took part in daring trapeze acts that put her hair to good use, kept it from getting bored, and plotting the destruction of all that is good and pure and lovely. Maybe she shaved her head and went on a pilgrimage to some remote lamasery and came back as a superhero with a dark past and some kick-ass martial arts moves. Maybe she sent her mother postcards from time to time. Maybe she wrote them as part of her circus act, using the tips of her hair, dipping them into an inkwell. These postcards, not to mention her calligraphic scrolls, are highly sought after by collectors nowadays. I have too. Miles stopped writing poetry for several years. He never went back to get his bike. He stayed away from graveyards and also from girls with long hair. The last I heard, he had a job writing topical haikus for the Weather Channel. One of his best-known haikus is the one about Tropical Storm Susie. It goes something like this. A young girl passes. In a hurry. Hair uncombed. Full of black devils.